Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today marks the 75th episode of Central Booking, and I'm honored to commemorate the occasion with bestselling author Matthew FitzSimmons, who has written a futuristic thriller with a killer premise, Constance. The year is 2040, and Constance D'Arcy, a clone who is activated following her human counterpart's death, must solve her own murder if she has any chance at survival. With an 18-month memory gap to resolve and powerful manipulative forces at her back, time is literally running out. It's a marked departure for the author, whose first series featured Gibson Vaughn, a former Marine and legendary hacker, throughout 5 critically and commercially successful books. FitzSimmons earned a BA in psychology from Swarthmore College, where he also immersed himself in the drama department. Later, he spent more than a decade teaching English literature and theater at a private high school. Having lived in cities throughout America as well as London and China, FitzSimmons now calls Washington, D.C. home. The idea for Constance was conceived in that dreamlike state between wakefulness and sleep, but didn't come to fruition for several years. Upon its eventual completion and release, it became an instant Amazon bestseller. The New York Times called the book a romp of a science fiction thriller, while Publishers Weekly awarded it a starred review, noting, "Tantalizing clues, complex motives, and shifting views of the truth flow around such issues as the relationship between money and power, the right to life, and the definition of self. FitzSimmons has upped his game with this one." Now, Matthew FitzSimmons reveals just how he took that initial idea for Constance and turned it into a timely and ultimately timeless whodunit. Hey everybody, welcome back to Central Booking. Believe it or not, this is episode 75, which is some kind of milestone, I think, and I am delighted to be in the virtual company of Wall Street Journal bestselling author Matthew FitzSimmons, whose new futuristic thriller Constance is out right now. You should go pick it up. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me on. How are you tonight?
I'm well. I'm in your company. Things are good. This is a good evening for me. I don't socialize much.
That's
but I
good. I like
people
that.
like you.
I like that. That's
No complaints. All right. So I want to start with the very basics of this book, because I have to say that this is one of the most compelling premises I've ever heard for a novel. So I'm wondering if you can break it down to its sort of bare bones essential and give us the elevator pitch for Constance.
Well, I'm terrible at the elevator pitch. I have nightmares about being in Hollywood in front of Jerry Bruckheimer or George Lucas with Steve Curry. They give me the elevator pitch, and I just go, and then I talk for the length of War and Peace until everyone's dead. That's how my elevator pitch is. So I will do my best, but the book is better than, I'm just going to say, whatever I say next, I think the book is better than this. Not that the book, I'm trying to upsell my book, I'm downselling my elevator pitch technique. So essentially, the elevator pitch is the book is about a woman who's investigating her own murder. To my mind, it's an old-fashioned detective story. And I wanted to write a book where the detective and the victim were the same person. And the way I contrived, elaborated to do that was that in the near future, we have commercial human cloning that essentially provides clone and memory backups for clients. And in the event of an unfortunate accident, or in the case of my hero, Con Darcy, an unfortunate murder, their clone is activated and their consciousness is downloaded into their clone, and they can continue with their lives. The big drawback is that there's a gap between the last time their memory was refreshed, updated, and their death. So however many days since the last time they went in for an update, because you have to go into the facility and sort of a spa day type thing, and it takes about 6 hours, and they try and get you to do it every month or so, but you can wind up with lag or missing time. And the book is basically the main character trying to reconstruct the missing time that led up to her death. So that was not an elevator pitch.
That was well done, though. That was good. And
Thank
I have
you,
to say, I was impressed by that, especially after the preamble. I was like, I don't know where we're going with this. But if it makes you feel better, I mean, the first thing I said, I basically butchered the English language because I realized I don't even know what the plural of premise is. I don't even know if there is one. So, so good on
I think
you.
it's premises. Premises. Let's go with premises, and we'll be
Maybe we
corrected
got
in the
it then. But
comments. There we
if this
go.
if this makes you feel better, anything that comes out of my mouth will make you you'll sound better regardless of what I say. So there, that puts everybody at ease. But I thought I'd ask you, I love to read acknowledgments, sections, and books. And so that's how I learned that the idea for this book really came in that sort of sweet spot between dreaming and wakefulness. And it was sort of like an epiphany. So I'm wondering if you can take us back to that moment and how you knew, man, I got to get up out of bed and I got to start writing some of this down because this is a story that I need to follow through on.
So I remember exactly where I was. I was in my old apartment. I was writing this. I also, in addition, before I wrote Constance, I wrote a 5-book series that's now known as the Gibson Vaughn series, and I was writing the second book in the series, Poison Feather, and I was in the middle of it, and I was at, there's a stage which all authors get to, or at least they all tell me to make me feel better, where you come to hate the book that you're writing, where you're like, okay, this is terrible. This is a terrible idea. I'm screwed. I'm stuck. I don't like anything going on. And you just have to kind of muscle your way through that. And then you sort of come out the others. It's basically like if you're in a relationship, it's that point in the relationship where between like new love and, like the first blush of where it's like, oh my God, I got to be around this person all the time. And I've been married for 60 years and I'm going to kill them. And you're just getting to that point, but you've got about 20 years left. And like, I think writing a book is kind of that mindset. Anyway, so I was in there and I was not in the mood to write. So I spent the day trying to sort of, I said, how could someone investigate their own murder? Just take your basic detective novel, detective murder fiction. And how could you do something new with it? Well, what if someone had to investigate their own murder? Okay, how could you do that? Well, there's an old 50s movie called DOA. It got remade in the 80s with Dennis Quaid about a guy who's poisoned and is dying and has to solve his murder before he dies. Okay, that's not what I wanted. And there's Patrick Swayze in Ghost. And there have been a lot of sort of supernatural takes on it. I was like, no, I want it to be a real person, a physical person investigating their own murder. I'm stubborn like that. And I couldn't come up with it. I couldn't come up with it all day long. And I got into bed. It was about midnight. And I was sort of like, sometimes you just don't have the idea. And I'm nodding off to sleep like you were describing. And I was like, well, what if it was a clone? And it was just like that thought popped in my head. Well, what if it was a clone? And I did one of those sort of like in bed Hollywood eureka sit up in bed moment. And I like go to my computer and I fire it up. And I wrote what is now chapter 4. At the time it was chapter 1. And I wrote chapter 4. It's a lot of it is still there. A lot of what I wrote that first night is still in the manuscript. And then I started world building and I started jotting down notes and it's like I'd never really done world building before. Like my other books had all taken place in what's essentially the real world. So you sort of get into that like, well, okay, so if I want to do cloning, when am I setting? That's your first question, because you don't have human cloning. So are we 500 years in the future? Are we 100 years in the future? I didn't want to do any of that. And so it was sort of that, so it was that, it was a really interesting process of one. So I'm looking over here. I told you I would do that, where I would just wander off.
That's right. You're all like, who's over there?
I know absolutely no one. This is me. Oftentimes you're walking around while I'm working. I'll just be. There's an old joke about authors, which is the hardest thing. What's the hardest thing about being an author? It's convincing your significant other that staring at the wall is work. Because you do that. You just spend a lot of time like navel gazing, staring at the wall. All right, well, what? Okay, so that was sort of how that eureka moment came, and then I spent a couple of hours. I mean, I didn't go to bed till about 4 or 5 in the morning, and I wrote a lot of the initial world building and ideas. And then I put it in a drawer and I didn't touch it again. I had a book to write. I was under contract. I was like, there's a real danger of like, ooh, I like shiny toys.
Right.
It's like, what's the new thing? It's like you're in that place where you're like, you're not really like, and you kind of want to cheat on your book. And you're like, oh, I want to go play with the fun new book I just came up with. And then you don't go back and you finish the book you actually have to finish. So I was like, no temptation, go in the drawer. And I didn't come back to it for a year or two. And I've been noodling with it and eventually got around to a place where I was like, okay, I'm ready to write this thing.
That's terrific. And there are some lessons to be learned in this, I think. First, for all of us who have these ideas that we think are great, and then we say, we're not going to write it down right now because we won't forget it. And then we do write the idea down. And then also, I think you made a very good point about, sticking with what you're working on at the time and then coming back to something. Because if you ask me how many projects I've started and how many I've finished, it would be very different numbers. But I wanted to ask you too, when Megan Beatty, the great Megan Beatty, when she pitched this book to me, she knows me so well. And she's like, look, it's sort of futuristic, but it's really a murder mystery in its heart. And I'm like, if you tell me to read something, Megan, I'm going to read it regardless of what it is. But I'm wondering if you can speak to that for a minute, because I think that there might be people like myself who, hear that there are some scientific, science fiction elements or speculative elements, and they may be a little bit leery to pick this book up, but it's really grounded, I think, in emotion and humanity and realism. So can you talk about that for people who might, think that they're off put just by the idea that it's a bit futuristic?
So yeah, that's an interesting, that is sort of a quandary, is sort of that we are, I think you're right in that we're often sort of not obsessed, that's a strong word, but we are convinced that there are only certain genres that we like to read. There are only certain stories that we want to take on, and that we really want to know what lane a particular story is going to be in. Okay, what is it? Like, it's like when you go to a movie, well, what kind of movie is it? We don't want like, I remember going to see Jim Carrey, and I was in Florida, and I went to see Jim Carrey, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And I sat down, and within about 30 minutes, half the audience had left the theater because they had come for a Jim Carrey movie.
Right.
And although I think Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is one of the best movies Jim Carrey ever made, it wasn't a Jim Carrey movie. Right. In the sense, it wasn't a Liar Liar. It wasn't a broad, Dumb and Dumber. It wasn't a broad, funny, shticky Jim Carrey movie. And people weren't prepared for it. They wanted to know what they were seeing. When they didn't get what they expected, they left the theater. And I think they missed out on a treat. I'm not a big, I'm not a big believer in, or I don't want to be. Maybe this is self-serving because I've written a book that does sort of occupy two different genre labels. But I look at a book like The Martian, Andy Weir's book. Right. Andy Weir wrote a book about an astronaut trapped on the moon, trying to get off. And it was a massive, massive hit. Millions of people read that book and loved it. And I think they loved it because of the main character. And at the end of the day, what he'd written was Robin Crusoe, which was a guy trapped, marooned, shipwrecked, if you will, literally on a planet, on an island, and with no one, and had to figure his way off. And that book, I think, succeeds because it's human, because it's grounded, because it's real. I think Handmaid's Tale, which is speculative and is set in the future, works because it's familiar and human. And I think any good story, regardless of the genre, is whatever lane. If you don't have a good character, if you don't have human, if you don't have humanity about it, the story, for me, doesn't work. Doesn't matter. We've read plenty. We've all read books that are just set in the neighborhood that aren't any good because you don't believe the character. It doesn't matter whether it's in a spaceship. It doesn't matter where it's set. If the people aren't real, if we don't believe them, we're done. So, I think so. My main character, Con Darcy, she's a 24-year-old woman from West Texas. She was in a band with her college friends. She has a tragedy in her past that she's not. When we meet her, she's not really moved on from a tragic event in her life. I like to think she's really relatable and very human and someone to root for. As she goes through this, struggle. And yes, the book is set in 2040, but I think it's going to be it's set in 2040 in DC and Virginia, in that area of the country. But I think it's going to be a very familiar America. Like, I don't think you would read and necessarily be there are no spaceships, there are no flying saucers, there are no flying cars. It is in the future, and there are some differences, but at the end of the day, it's a story about a woman who's trying to uncover her past. So that's my pitch. I think if you like science fiction, I think you will like it. If science fiction isn't for you, I understand that, but I think I think it's worth stepping out of that narrow is not the right word, out of those, to take a chance on something that you might not have.
Sure.
So let it be Constance.
Why not? It should be Constance,
And why not?
I'm like, if you like a mystery, come on. I mean, it's a clone who basically goes back and has to solve the murder of her real self. So, great premise. And I think it's funny too. I think one of the characters even notes in the books that even though it's futuristic, wow, things really haven't changed, all that much in the 25 years or so, that have passed from our reality to theirs.
Well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, John, because it's, like, that was an interesting, when I was doing the world building for it, how much would things change between now and 2040 was an interesting question to ask. And the game, have you ever seen the movie Blade Runner?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Blade Runner was made in 1980 or 1981. I'm going to get my dates wrong, but one of those 2 years. And it's set in 1999.
Right.
19 years later, and their vision of America in 1999 was space battles off the shoulder of Orion and humanoid, humanoid synthetic people and flying cars and off-world colonies. And I was like, all right, I don't want to be that guy who is that horrifically, spectacularly wrong about the future. So the game I played, and this is a game I would say to you, is let's say we were in the year 2000, or let's say we were in 2001, and you were walking down the street of your town. How could you tell that it was 2001 or 2021 just from walking down the street?
That's interesting. I don't even know. I'm still having trouble wrapping my mind around like the fact that people don't really listen to CDs anymore. Like everything's digital.
Right, but that would be one of the big, so cell phones.
Yeah, or there's no record stores anymore, like there was back then.
Right, but you walk around your house. Your house looks largely the same as it did 20 years ago, as it did 40 years ago. The house I grew up in, still have light switches, still have light bulb. I mean, they're still essentially the same. Most of the changes are sort of under the, under the hood, so to speak. We have Wi-Fi, we have computers, we have flat screen TVs, but we still have TVs. Anyway, so I made a conscious decision that the futuristic elements, with the exception of human cloning, obviously, would be more subtle, would be more. My guess is in 2040 will not look that much different than 2020.
Right. And good point. I mean, it is far more grounded than Blade Runner. It's not that, type of futuristic thing. And just a really quick digression, because something you said a few minutes ago kind of struck a chord with me when you were talking about the Jim Carrey movie, Eternal Sunshine. I remember seeing that, and I would have to say that that's actually probably my favorite Jim Carrey movie because he was so subdued. And I tend to like Will Ferrell movies where he plays like a normal, less energized version of himself.
Did you see Stranger Than Fiction?
Yeah, and I liked that a lot. And even the Daddy's Home movies, like he's a little bit more low key. So I tend to to like those. So that was an interesting comparison that you made. I digress a lot, and
No,
I
no,
should
no, no, no.
apologize
I
for
mean,
that.
there's a long tradition of taking over the top comic actors and turning them into subdued, like Robin Williams,
Right, yeah.
Steve Martin, Jim Carrey, Will Ferrell. There's a long tradition of taking sort of over the top comedic actors and like bringing them down. And now they're going to be serious actors, and they'll be very,
That face.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and you can
That was
really
my serious
appreciate them
actor
on a
face.
different level, which is
Yeah.
really kind of nice. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about Constance or Con too, because such a great character. And one of the things I really liked about this is obviously there's this big mystery about, what happened to her real self, for lack of a better term. But as you mentioned at the very beginning of this interview, there's that 18-month memory gap as well. So there's sort of multiple mysteries playing out because she's really motivated to fill in that missing time. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit about that journey and how that really motivates her decision making, because she acts in a way that a lot of people don't expect her to, which is, I think, very clever and unique.
So, it's a little bit of that nature and the nurture argument. It's like I've seen movies where, where two characters fall in love, and then through, at some point, another version of that character steps in and they fall in love the exact same way. And I don't actually think that's how people work, that certain things have to happen at a certain moment. I don't know if I'm explaining this well. I think there are moments in our lives where, there'll be a spark and something will happen. But if that same moment happened 18 months later, you wouldn't have that same reaction. You'd be somewhere else in your life. And so one of the things I really wanted to play with was this idea that as she doesn't quite recognize the choices that the original Con made, because the original Con was somewhere else in her life. And our Con, the Con of the story, is somewhere else. She's under all this duress because of the events of the book. And so when she meets some characters that were part of her original's life, she doesn't have the same reaction to them because it's just a different.
Right.
She's a different, she's a different person. She's in a different place. And also the person she's meeting, is in a different place in their life. And why would, they're not going to have the same emotional reaction to meeting her the second time as they did the first time. Like, it's just, that's not how it works in at least. And that was something I really wanted. Does that get at what you were asking?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wanted to ask too, one of the things that I found really interesting about this too is a little bit more background. So Constance's aunt is basically responsible, for the cloning. She came up with this. It was her technology, her vision. And even though she was sort of on the outs, with the family, she allowed Constance to have a clone, which is something that usually is a privilege for the super rich because, they're extremely expensive. So when she sort of gets reactivated or brought back, there's a couple of colleagues. It's, I think, Dr. Fenton and who is it here? The gentleman, Vernon Gaddis.
Yep.
And so, they're colleagues of the aunts, and they both sort of have a stake in Constance and what she chooses to do. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what each of those people sort of wants from Constance, and then how she's able to take her own agenda and sort of play off of that, because, she's very much her own character, and she's not looking to please this person or that person. She's sort of using them to suit her own needs, which again, I think is a nice, fresh spin on story.
Well, it's fresh and it's not fresh, because to some extent there's an element, again, because this is a little bit of an old, the skeleton underneath it is it's a detective novel, and Constance is the detective, and Gaddis is the rich billionaire who needs her to do something. It's very much The Big Sleep. It's very much a Raymond Chandler setup where Raymond Chandler's detective is working for the wealthy man, but he's also got his own agenda, and the detective in sort of like as an archetype is sort of that, like, yes, I'm doing this, but I'm an independent agent, and I'm not, you may be paying me, but I'm not, I'm not going to betray my code, my morals, my what have you. And so that was, that was a really fun sort of genre piece to play with, was that, I mean, yes, within the world, and one of the things I wanted to do was that, one of the decisions I made in the world building was that cloning would not be available to everyone, that it would be very much a 1%er technology, that most people would be excluded from this. But then it was important to me that my main character did not have a lot of money, because money gives you protection, right, and a shield. And I wanted her to really sort of feel the full brunt of, you're on your own, you've got to figure this out. So I had to basically, like, how can I give someone who's got no money a really expensive privilege? And so the aunt character, Abigail Stickling, her mother's sister, it sort of was my device, my entry point into, like, okay, how can I have my cake and eat it too? How can I do both of these things at the same time? And then, as she, at the start of, her aunt has passed away, so she's really dealing with her aunt's partner, Vernon Gaddis, and the head of the company, Dr. Fenton, and that tension of knowing that where once powerful interests want something from you, and have the ability to make, what's your price? It comes, there's a certain point at which, power is very, very hard to resist. Even if you want to resist it, it can be very pernicious. And so it was, she winds up sort of literally between two rocks and a hard place. It's there's a lot of money, there's a lot of interest in her, and she's got very little going for her other than her wits and her willpower, and that's always a fun story to tell.
Sure, and it's really this great conflicted trio of characters, and it's so fun to watch, how they maneuver around each other and trying to figure out what, everybody's end games are. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. I am going to move into more general territory in a second, but I did just want to ask you one more thing about the cloning aspect of the book, because I was reading it and I kept thinking, okay, clones were not really there yet, but I think that many of us are going to respond to that storyline, because, the personal debates, the political debates, the professional debates that are taking place around this idea of cloning could so much be applied to so many other hot button topics that we're seeing right now, even if it's, immigration, abortion, minorities, marginalized figures. So I was just wondering if you could talk about, how people might respond to that idea, because I think it relates to so many things that are present in our everyday life right now. We don't call it a clone, we call it something else, but the reaction is very similar.
So I don't want to speak too much to how people should react to it. Obviously, hopefully I've written a book that will let people react to, have whatever reaction to it that is natural to them. I would say that the best speculative fiction, and what I do like about science fiction is that it allows us that I think really good science fiction, speculative fiction, allows us to sort of step away from our own world, but reflect back. Not that I'm in that category, but a Clockwork Orange, or a Handmaid's Tale, or a Blade Runner, or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. That, like, the best of those books should remind us of our own times, and are generally written with an eye towards not necessarily direct metaphor, but like the book 1984 was Orson, not Orson, I've just forgotten the name of the author, Orwell.
Right.
Okay. Okay. And that is literally Orwell speaking to what he was seeing going on in England of his day through the metaphor, through this world that he had created. And I think, that, so the advent of human cloning is, an idea that interested me a great deal was this idea that technology often is given to the world without the world necessarily asking for it or even knowing that it wanted it and then adapting to it. And the more earth-shattering the technology, I think sometimes the harder it is for people to wrap their minds around. I mean, there's a robust community of people who claim that the moon landing never happened.
Right.
Because I think, the idea of, and that the world is flat, that there is something that is so terrifying about that. For thousands of years we believed we were a marble in the back of a turtle, and then someone had the audacity to go into space and take a photograph and be like, "There's no turtle here, folks. It's just a giant rock." And it's also not the center of the universe. The sun is, and the sun's not the center of the universe. We're just one of a bajillion solar systems, and that's a lot after thousands of years of being told we're the absolute center. I think we're seeing some of this in vaccine hesitancy with the new round of vaccine. I mean, I wrote this book before all of this began, but the kind of this new technology that's doing this new kind of vaccine.
Right.
I don't understand how it works. I'm a reasonably smart man. I've read about it. I don't understand how it works. I understand how old style vaccines work.
Right.
I can wrap my mind around that. I understand that conceptually. The new stuff, I don't understand it. I have basically said, all right, I'm going to trust in the scientific process. I'm going to trust in, but there is, for clearly a segment of the population, that inability to conceptualize it and understand it is just an earth shatter and a terror, And so I think, I think without even intending it, I think that but that is sort of the general parallel. I mean, I remember back when I was 11 or 12, we had our first test tube baby. Right, the first in vitro fertilization, and I called it a test tube baby because someone at the time who didn't like the idea, who thought that was unnatural,
Right.
labeled it test tube babies. And for 15 years, in vitro fertilization carried a stigma to it. And like it was unnatural. That's not how, for thousands of years, that's not how babies were made. And then science was like, oh, no, we can do it another way. And now there have been millions of in vitro pregnancies, and I guess the culture has caught up to that.
Right.
But there was a moment of, whoa, this is changing my concept of what a human is.
Right.
And so I wrote baked into my book is that same thing. If you introduce human cloning, there is going to be a sizable, like, but wait, like that's not how, if you die, you die. And now you're going to say, no, if you die, you can continue. But how does that work? What are the ethics of that? What are the legalities of that? What are the morals of that? And science doesn't always, it's like, it's a Jurassic Park thing. I mean, not to quote the great Jeff Goldblum, but he's got, Crichton was often writing about, excesses in science and abuses of science. And Jurassic Park literally came out of his his concern about the DNA project. It was his expression of how are we going to use what we're learning about DNA? Oh, we're going to make dinosaurs? And then Jeff Goldblum goes, you were so busy building this thing, you didn't stop to ask whether you should. And science has no interest in should we. It's really mostly interested in can we. Can we build an atomic bomb? Oh yeah, we can build an atomic bomb. Should we build an atomic bomb? That's someone else's problem.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, that's one of the dualities that always gets me thinking, is that whole idea of progress, versus peril, and why is something developed and how is it meant to be used? And, how do we develop it versus how somebody perceives it, because there's always the potential there to do something with it that it wasn't necessarily intended for. So I love reading books like this because, you find yourself having sort of a mental debate as you're reading it, which I think is great. I mean, I think the best fiction makes you reflect on the world around you, and hopefully you take away something from that. And I wanted to ask you actually about your background, because you grew up, you studied psychology, you were sort of immersed in theater. I would think that both of those things probably help you in storytelling, albeit in different ways. Psychology with character development and motivation, and then theater with sort of plotting and pace and placement. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how you're able to draw on your past when you are doing this kind of world building.
So, I mean, I think you've already answered you answered the question better than I could answer the question. You said it exactly right. I mean, I think that the theater, while a very different discipline than writing books, you're taking it in theater. When I was in the theater, I was directing. That was my focus, and you're taking, usually, except in, for the most part, you're taking a pre-existing text, and you're trying to build characters from words. All right, so these characters say these things, and you're basically, it's sort of an act of sort of a reverse creation. So, you read Death of a Salesman, and you're like, all right, what would a Willy Loman look like? How would he dress? And any actor does that. That's what a director does. Is you sort of like this reverse. Well, here's what he says, and here's what he does. So, what does he look like? How does he move? How does he talk? How does he, who's that person? And the great actor is the one who can sort of do that reverse process. And then as a director, working with a group of actors, you sort of trying to help them do that work, and then also trying to build a scene. Okay, well, now Willy Loman's got to have, a huge fight with his son. Where are they going to stand? Where are they going to sit? How are they going to interact with each other? When are there going to be silences? When are they going to come together? When are they going to move apart? And those are all the tools of directing. It's for the stage is you basically you can move two characters far apart. You're suggesting distance, emotional distance, bring them close. There are a lot of that's a very elemental and basic tool, but there's all of those things go into building character. So I'd like to think that paid off for novel writing. I unfortunately do not have a pre-existing text. So I'm having novel writing is essentially a blank page, and you are building characters, building the world, then building scenes, and sort of like, so the interesting question is, where do you start? Like, do you start with a character, or do you start with an situation or scenario? What's your entry point into a story? And I think I think for some authors, some writers, it might be the same entry point every time, and they have a process. For me, it's been different each time.
Sure.
Sometimes it's the scenario. For Constance, it really did just start with how could someone investigate their own murder, and everything else that came from building that out. And obviously, it's like, I studied psychology in university, and that has been a huge boon to sort of understanding the human dynamics. And theater, I think, has been, I don't know who I'd be without that piece of my education. And I like to think of writing a scene like directing a play, except the actors don't take breaks and they don't talk back. And they don't go to their dressing room and slam. Although that's a lie, because sometimes the whole thing just goes to its dressing room and slams the door. And then you're just out of luck for the rest of the day until they come back out. We call that writer's block, and it's a lot of fun.
I was going to say, initially I thought maybe your characters are more compliant because of that background, but maybe not.
No.
They're going to do what they're going to do.
They can be plenty divas if you want to be.
That's right. All right. Well, if you can indulge me for just a few more questions, I will let you
You
off the
bet.
hook. Just a few more. But I also wanted to ask you, you also have the distinction of having taught English Lit for, I think, about a decade or so. So I wanted to ask you, for creative people, how do you think that exposure to sort of a great inventory of written works, how does that benefit aspiring creatives? And also, what kind of learning environment, have you found sort of benefits people with that creative mind? Because I think so much of what people take out of a class is what's sort of presented to them and how it's presented to them. So what did you find worked best?
So I taught at a small private school here in DC where the classes were about 10 or 15 kids. I taught 12th grade English. And it was, it was sort of a progressive educational model, sort of in the John Dewey, it was that, it was sort of a collaborative model, which suited me a great deal because, theater is a very collaborative art form. I loved rehearsing a play more than just about anything in my life. Getting in a room with a bunch of smart, creative people, and we're not going to come out until we've figured this problem out together. We'll just throw ideas out. To some extent, like writing it's a much lonelier, more solitary occupation, and I miss it. And I know I've got a friend who's an author who doesn't show or talk about what they're working with anyone until it's done. And I'm the opposite. I'm like, I will write something like, okay, who wants to read this? Who wants to talk to me about this? Because that's sort of my theater piece, which is just like, give me your ideas. Tell me you hate it. Tell me why you hate it. Explain it to me. Help me be better. Help me to be smarter. And so that was a big piece of it. Teaching. So the interesting thing about it is that I've given this. I've made this point before, but I really like this point, so I'm going to make it again here tonight, which is one of the pieces of advice everyone gives writers is to read. Read a lot, read broadly. Read, and it is great advice, and absolutely do it. I did kind of the opposite while I was an English teacher, in that I read, instead of reading broadly, I read very narrowly. I read the same books over and over again over a course of years. I read James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son 30 or 40 times. I read Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison 30 or 40 times. These great, great books that, I would read them with the class. I would read them before the year started. So I was reading them twice a year. Sometimes more than that, because you're constantly re-engaging with it one way or another. And so what I would say is, if you read broadly, but if you read something that really you connect with, and you're like, oh my, like this moved me, or this got me, or I stayed up all night reading this, read it again, and then read it again, and then read it again. And when we listen to our favorite songs 1,000 times. We watch our favorite movies dozens of times. Oftentimes we read a good book once. We read it in about 2 or 3 weeks, and we think that we got it. We go, okay, I'm done with that. What's next? Books take a while to read, so I understand like the impetus to just move on. Like it's like, well, I got a lot to read.
Right.
But if you get something that really and stop, break it down, read it again, take a break from it, come back to it, and figure out how Toni Morrison accomplishes what she accomplishes, how James Baldwin, frames something, how his sentences work. Kazuo Ishiguro, who I think is one of my favorite authors. He takes about 6 years to write a book. I just read Clara and the Sun. I read it in about 3 weeks. I didn't get it. There's no way that I got it. I mean, I read it and I enjoyed it, and it was a good book. But I guarantee you, I didn't get everything. I didn't catch everything. There's just no way. It's impossible. So, anyways, that's my big advice: is that you get your 4 or 5 books that you're like, these are my canon. These are the books that and tear them apart.
I think that's great advice, and it's not something you often hear, but I always find when I actually do have the time to go back and revisit something every time, like you were saying, you find hopefully something different and you come away with different levels of appreciation. And actually that lends itself very well to my next question, because I always like to start to wind down with, advice for aspiring writers. And I always ask, what is the best advice in terms of a creative or writing life that you remember being ever given? And then the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself throughout the process. So I'm just wondering if there's anything else you want to add to your last answer that encompasses that.
So the hardest lesson I had to learn for myself was one that we talked about sort of when we were beginning, which is at least for me, I spent, I didn't publish Short Drop until I was in my early 40s. And I spent a good part of my 30s while I was teaching, writing in the summer and whatnot. And I, like you, had drawers full of, or I guess computer folders full of partially completed, 60 pages of a screenplay or 20,000 words of a novel or this or that. And I actually still have some of those. And I'm embarrassed, frankly, how long it took me to learn this lesson. It was that it's fun to start things. It's work to finish them. I think I use new ideas as a way to avoid that hard work. And as I was joking earlier, like, ooh, shiny new toy.
It's true.
I want to write about the clones. And at some point while I was writing the clone thing, which I had been waiting 5 years to write, I had another idea and I went, ooh, shiny new toy. And me 15 years ago would have put clone aside and probably put Constance aside and never come back to it because it was just too hard. It felt too much like work, and writing was just there's passion and fun and creativity. And it took me a long time to learn how to be a professional and to see it through and to get over that hump. And it's incredibly satisfying when you do.
Right.
It's worth it. It's hard. I mean, like right now, the book I'm writing, I am literally at the point. It's funny, I am literally at the point where I don't like it anymore. I think it's stupid. I wish I hadn't started it. And I have another idea, and I'm like, ooh,
there it is, that shiny toy.
There's that shiny toy, and I've taken notes on the shiny toy, but I'm not allowed to play with it. It's up on the shelf, and I can't take it down until this is done. And that has made all the difference. And I'm sure that there are people who can work on 4 things at a time. I don't know how. I mean, Stephen King writes 6 books in the time it takes me to make my breakfast. So there are people, but I would argue that they are the exception to every rule. Stephen King is a god, and I am but a lonely typist, and and there's a difference. And so yes, that would be my big, is finish it, even if it's awful. Editing is so much easier than writing. Right. Just even if it's direct, just get it done. It's a mindset changer and incredibly valuable and helpful.
Absolutely. Yes, there is something to be said for the end. Literally reaching the end is a terrific thing.
God. Oh my God.
And good news, we've about reached the end. So, but last question for you, and this is great because you've already told me that you're one of those people who likes to talk about, what they're working on. But I always like to allow, authors to leave us with a little teaser. And the interweb, tells me that as much as Constance, I think, was sort of conceived as a standalone, it looks like there's going to be a follow-up to that. And I'm wondering if that shiny, idea that you were talking about, is that the sequel, or is that, the project that comes after the Constance sequel? So
that's the project. It was funny. I mean, you're right. Like I was very steadfast that this Constance was going to be a standalone. I had written a 5-book series, and I was like, I want to write a standalone. And my publisher said, okay, standalone, we got it. And then I got done, and they went, we'd really like another one. And I went, well, that's too bad. I don't have another one. You can't have another one. Remember what we talked about when I said it was a standalone? They were like, well, that's too bad because we really like Constance and we want another one. And I went away and I took a shower, as I do regularly. I don't want to make it sound like it was a one-off. I took a shower and I had an idea for not exactly a sequel, a follow-up in the world. I was in the shower for about 15 minutes, and by the time I got out, I pretty much had the whole thing. It was kind of a eureka moment. I didn't sit up real sunlight because the shower is slippery, but I was like, okay. And I called my publisher. I was like, okay, I'll do a sequel. And they were like, what are you talking about? You said you didn't have one. I said, well, I took a shower. No, and so here we go. So I am in the latter stages of writing a book called Chance, which is the second book. It takes place 2 years after the events of Constance. Con is not the central character, although she is in the book. And I believe I'm really excited about it. I'm surprised because I really didn't want to write a second one, but I really liked the idea. I think it looks at the cloning puzzle from a different point of view, and I think expands the world and opens it up in sort of interesting ways. And I hope people will come along on the journey. Yeah, I think it's knock on wood if you got. I think it's I'm once I start liking it again, I'm just I think apart from this, like where I am right now, where this is the worst thing I've ever done in my life. I think it's going to turn out well. So fingers crossed. Fingers crossed to getting to the end.
Yes, it's coming, and once you get there, then you can play with that other shiny new toy.
New toy.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to horrify you. You're, speaking of the creative epiphany you had in the shower, like you're making me want to step into my shower, which is right behind me.
On you what? Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian author, wrote not Year of Living, I guess 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera, was famous for his long showers. And he lived in Bogota, and he had to put in like 3 extra hot water heaters because he would get in the shower and he didn't come out until he knew exactly what he was doing for the day. And sometimes he was in there a good long time. So I'm not that bad. I don't need extra hot water heaters, but never underestimate the power of a good shower to help you figure out a thorny plot problem.
I might have to try that. So while we're in the shower having these great generative process ideas, everybody else can go out and pick up Constance. They need to.
Ooh, I like that.
Right now, and then, you have a chance to look forward to. So that's pretty awesome. Matthew FitzSimmons, thank you so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate it.
John, thanks for taking the time and having me on. It was great.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.